Let's talk the politics of the Gilded Age. Now, for most people, especially if you are young me sitting in a high school U.S. history class, this time period is the era of President General Beardo P. Midwesterner. The reason I say that is because at this point, if you're trying to name the presidents from beginning to end, I'm not sure if that's a worthwhile endeavor, but some people do it. It's around the time of Abraham Lincoln, or really right after Abraham Lincoln, that people go, well, there was James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln, then the bearded one, and the other bearded one, and yeah, Theodore Roosevelt's there somewhere. And that's generally the way it goes. And to be honest, there's a good reason for that. So, yes, this time period is a time of political non-entities. And that reputation is kind of fairly deserved. There's a reason that these people are so forgettable. So you're like, well, Mr. Dry, why are you lecturing us on why some people deserve to not be remembered? That's a little contradictory. Well, that's a very shrewd observation. But the reason they deserve to be forgotten to a certain extent is because of that very fact is in itself interesting. Because remember, one of the reasons that the presidents become less powerful during the Gilded Age is because of something that we observe during the American Civil War. Remember, during the American Civil War, the presidency as an institution becomes much, much more powerful, and that kind of scares Congress a little bit. There's a long and difficult and acrimonious Reconstruction period led by Andrew Johnson, and remember that Johnson, at the end of the American Civil War, gets impeached. So what that kind of demonstrates is that it's Congress that is sort of dictating the national agenda for the most part. The other thing that kind of happens, though, is that this is an era in which everything is becoming organized and bureaucratized. You know, that is kind of one of the themes of industrialization, right? The fact that everything is becoming organized and complicated, from corporations to social organizations. Everything is becoming much, much more, again, organized and bureaucratic. And that also, applies to politics. Obviously, political parties aren't a new thing, but political parties become larger, more important, and more influential than ever before. So during this time period, I know this is going to come as a shock, but the Republican and Democratic parties continue their decades-long rivalry that really began in the time period before the American Civil War. Well, here's the ironic thing. So the American Civil War had sort of destroyed the primary source of division between the two parties, the issue of slavery. There were certainly some redeemers in the South that would have loved to have probably turned back the clock and basically restored slavery to its place of prominence in the South, but realistically, most Democrats nationwide realized that that ship had sailed. So here's the weird thing. You have two political parties without really any central conflict to mobilize against. Slavery's gone, and so the question is, what does that mean for the Republicans and Democrats? So remember that political parties are typically form around issues that speak to the American people. Well, that's not really happening at this point. And so there's this kind of weird time period in the Gilded Age where, in the aftermath of the Civil War, both parties are kind of trying to figure out what is their reason for existing. So, that being said, though, you would be mistaken if you believe that political parties are just completely obsolete or unimportant. So, really, if you look at the major difference between the two parties consistently during this time period, it's that Republicans are slightly more in favor of businesses and tariffs than the Democrats. But philosophically, there's really nothing, or not too much, that divides the two parties from one another. So, something we'll come back to, you know, Republicans are slightly more pro-business than Democrats, but Democrats themselves are actually somewhat pro-business. Republicans are pro-business because they believe that business is good for the United States. But Democrats are pro-business to a certain extent because of their philosophy. Remember that Democrats are sort of the party that sort of trace their origins to Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party. And Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they were a classically liberal party. For those of you who don't know what classical liberalism is, you might want to go ahead and take note of this. Classical liberalism is basically what we would think of today as libertarianism. In other words, the Democratic Republicans were a party that believed that were sort of traumatized by the American experience during the American Revolution, and believed that government should do as little as possible. And that's almost more of a moral observation rather than a political or an economic one. And so the Democratic Republicans and the Democrats have a strong sort of classically liberal philosophy sort of running through that party. Now, of course, that didn't prevent Democrats during the lead up to the Civil War from demanding that states basically and states and territories recognize slavery, especially in the Western frontier. But in general, Democrats were generally pro-business because they didn't believe in regulating business. Because in their mind, even though they generally were more suspicious of the robber barons than Republicans, they also were even more suspicious about giving government the power to regulate robber barons and businesses. So, in other words, if you think about the major political issue of the Gilded Age, the expansion of businesses and corporations and what that means for American democracy, neither political party has an answer to that. Or let's say neither political party really offers a dramatically new opinion. Republicans believe that business is good. Democrats believe that, well, business might lead to some growing pains, but we don't really want to give the government the ability to do anything about it because that might create a problem that's much worse than the one we have now. So, that being said, again, it's easy to kind of think of this time period as being one in which politics is therefore completely boring or uninteresting. But even though partisan differences and political party differences are fairly small, Americans in this time period vote with these massive turnout numbers. So even though these presidents right here are boring, weak, and uninteresting, for the most part, the fact is that Americans tend to vote with 70 to 80% turnout rates during a time period before, mass public transportation and the automobile. 70 to 80% of eligible voters were actually voting. In comparison to the presidential election of 2004, there's only a 56% turnout rate. And by the way, the presidential election of 2004 revolved around, among other minor existential issues, the Iraq War, whereas these other elections in the 1870s and 1880s were, let's say, didn't involve matters that dramatic, and still Americans voted in overwhelming numbers. Before we move on, I should kind of explain what I mean by this title here. Obviously, Beardo is fairly understandable. It's the time period of great presidential facial hair, I suppose. Also, most of the presidents during this time period were presidents, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, who were either generals or sort of lower level, or well, not lower level, mid-level officers during the Civil War. And by the way, that becomes very important because even though slavery is kind of taken away as an issue, and especially after Reconstruction in 1877, Reconstruction ends in 1877, the fact is that the memory of the Civil War is constantly played up at the ballot box. It's an electoral campaign called "Waving the Bloody Shirt," basically sort of playing to the glorious contributions of the Union Army during the American Civil War. Uh, so most of the presidents were former generals. Most of them were from pretty middle class origins, actually. I know it's kind of funny because obviously we think of the Gilded Age as being a time period in which the wealthy controlled everything. But if you look at politics, what kind of happens is that you don't see the type of upper class people run for office the way you do during the early republic. If you want to find, like, ironically, aristocratic presidents, you don't really have to look any further than George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Monroe or Madison. Um, it's ironic that during this time period that we associate with sort of class conflict and the haves lording it over the have-nots. Most of the presidents themselves were of fairly humble middle-class origins, and partially this kind of helps explain one of the key points from the Gilded Age, and that is that most of these presidents um, would have been kind of in awe of people like J.P. Morgan or John D. Rockefeller. Because they were so far removed from the world in which they lived. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, it was so hard for the government to rein in some of the business practices that we talked about in our last lecture. Last point on parties before we move on. Uh, Being a member of a party wasn't just important in terms of who you voted for, but it was also, for many Americans, an important source of identity. In other words, being a Republican or being a Democrat was strongly associated with, your religion or your racial or ethnic background. Who your family was, what social class you ran with, what part of the country you were from. We begin to see the emergence of these strong party loyalties being correlated with these other sort of identifiers. So, just as an example, I'm going to go through typically identity groups that we associate with one party or the other during this time period. So the Republican Party was the party of kind of mainline Protestant churches. It was the party of most New Englanders, most African Americans, and for those of you who remember anything about the Civil War and Reconstruction, that should be a pretty obvious point. It was the party of Union Army veterans and of business elites. For the Democratic Party, it was associated with being the party of Southern whites. It was associated with being the party of most immigrants, with the exception maybe of German immigrants. It was also associated with being the party of Catholicism and religious minorities in general. Uh, and if you're looking for any consistency here, you're just going to frustrate yourself. Because, I mean, think about this. You have the Democratic Party in the South, which is the party of kind of the landed planter class, the most elite and wealthy, sort of hereditary class in the South, and, arguably pre-robber barons in the entire country. And at the same time, it's also the party of, of newly arrived immigrants, people who are kind of at on the poorest rungs of society. And at the same time, remember that the Democratic Party is also the party that is at least I don't want to say in favor of Jim Crow at the national level, but certainly it's decided to kind of just ignore racial issues in the South. But at the same time, it's also the party that tends to be the most multicultural, believe it or not, the party that's more accepting of immigrants. Take a while to think about that. I'm still thinking about this, and I've taught this course for a number of years. It's inherently confusing. Political parties are confusing. Now, if you remember your Ulysses S. Grant, and you should, you might remember that his two presidential terms were mired by scandal and baseless accusations of corruption. Now, the question is, those corruption scandals in Grant's two terms, well, where do they come from? Is it because of Grant? Is it because the political culture of the United States has just become, corrupt and unethical? Or is it because of the extraordinary growth of business and industry during the Civil War and afterwards? And you can kind of have a debate on where that corruption comes from. But the thing is that one reason for why people have such strong loyalty to political parties is because there's now serious money to be made in politics. This is kind of where politics and business sort of come together and form kind of a toxic relationship to a certain extent. And you can see this with the rise of the machines. And at this point, by the way, I mean, this would be kind of like the ultimate steampunk story, the story of artificial intelligence developing self-awareness and trying to conquer us all. But I'm not talking about these machines, unfortunately. I'm talking about political machines, like the ones we've actually already talked about. In fact, the most famous political machine during this time period, the one in Tammany Hall, New York City, was actually established all the way back by, Aaron Burr. But during this time period, political machines become more powerful and influential than ever before. Just to give you a definition of what a political machine is. A political machine is a party organization led by a boss that commands enough political power to control or monopolize an area. And the thing is that think of, in some respects, political machines are almost like the political equivalent of these large corporate trusts that we've already talked about. And they use kind of like these, some similar monopolistic practices, except that on the whole, monopolies sort of operated not really so much against the law, but outside the law. The law never really sort of anticipated the emergence of these large, nationally, spanning corporations. On the other hand, political machines more or less operated, against the law. So, just for example, take the words of political boss William Marcy Tweed, who dominated Tammany Hall during the aftermath of the Civil War. Listen to some of the practices that Tweed and other party bosses used to ensure that their political party dominated local elections. The most valued voters grew beards before the balloting. Tweed says, quote, "When you voted them with their whiskers on, you take them to a barber and scrape off the chin fringe. Then you vote them again with the side lilacs and a mustache. Then to a barber again, off comes the sides, and you vote them a third time with the mustache. If that ain't enough, and the box can stand a few more ballots, clean off the mustache and vote them plain face. That makes one of them good for 4 votes." Some of Tweed's supporters voted as many as 4 times, and Tweed, as Tweed put it, "The ballots made no result. The counters made the result." If you want a classic example of voter fraud in American history, to be honest, it's hard to find a better example than the types of practices used by these political machines in the 1870s and 1880s. It might put that turnout result, it might make that turnout result that I talked about earlier, the 70 to 80% turnout result, it might make that a little suspect when you take that into consideration. Now, Boss Tweed was a Democratic Party boss in Tammany Hall, and he was certainly the most famous party boss, but certainly not the only one. And I'm going to go through just kind of how party bosses and political machines were able to dominate elections during this time period. It kind of is kind of an extension of what we talked about earlier on with patronage, that a politician is going to support you as long as you support them. So one of the things that these party bosses would do is their goal would be to mobilize voters on their behalf. And one thing that we have to kind of think about is that party bosses like Boss Tweed would mobilize voters that had very little power and voice for themselves. In fact, Tammany Hall was very good at mobilizing the votes of Irish American immigrants. And if you remember, during the 1840s and 50s especially, Irish Americans were heavily discriminated against, and really actually beyond the 1850s. And so Tweed realized that Irish votes are counted the same as, as English American votes or German American votes. And so what he was very good at is providing these Irish immigrants and immigrants in general with a certain degree of support. So for many immigrants who would arrive on Ellis Island, they would be quickly met by a representative or agent of the local Democratic Party organization led by Boss Tweed. And to these voters, well, first, Tweed might sort of steer them to a low-cost place to stay. He might steer them towards a place to work. He might basically provide everything for them. And Boss Tweed would only demand one thing in exchange. The fact that in every election, local or national, if you were going to be given these cared for by Boss Tweed, you had to also take care of the Democratic Party. Now, of course, this practice was incredibly corrupt. It's basically like giving your vote in exchange for free stuff. But the thing is that many of these immigrants, you have to remember, were fleeing from poverty. And many immigrants were fleeing from countries in which they had no ability to vote in the first place. Or if they did, their vote was heavily suppressed. Now, in comparison, in the United States, they're being encouraged to vote. And yes, they do have to vote for one party, but it's the party that has looked out for them, and they're getting, stuff, basic necessities in exchange. And so I think that, not that I'm endorsing this behavior, but we do have to kind of take that into consideration when we're sort of assessing the motivations of, those who support these political machines. So what would happen is that once your party wins a local election, you appoint them into positions of prominence, or you reward your supporters in some way, shape, or form. So what would happen is, actually, this kind of goes back to the spoil system that we talked about with Andrew Jackson. But it's in the Gilded Age where this system kind of matures and actually kind of warps far beyond the wildest dreams of its earliest supporters. So what would happen is that actually there's a major corruption scandal during this time period called the Tweed Raid, in which basically construction contracts in the state of New York are being rewarded to those companies that support the Democratic Party. So these companies would be paid an exorbitant amount of money at taxpayer expense, and these companies would sort of funnel this money back to these Democratic Party organizations. So Tweed and his followers win. Democrats win. The Democratic Party's supporters win. The only, organization or the only group that really loses is, the taxpayer. The taxpayers who are footing the bill for all this, but they don't matter according to the logic of the spoil system and patronage. The only groups that matter are the people who support you. And then, by the way, once you obtain political power, the idea is to use your political influence to ensure that your party monopolizes elections going forward through practices like redistricting, which we're still kind of dealing with to a certain extent, and other ways as well. So here's the problem. Um, our democracy rests on the idea that if you have political problems, the only way to deal with that is through political solutions. If you don't like who's in charge, well, run for office and vote them out. Pretty simple, except what happens when you can't vote them out? Because the whole idea of a political machine is to ensure that your party's candidates effectively can't be voted out, that there's not going to be any real competition. So the question is, who can kind of emerge, or what can we do to fix the problem? The issue is that, I mean, we're a very litigious society, and so the first idea might be to, take them to court. The issue there is that local police and judges could be affiliated with party organizations themselves. They're not supposed to be, but for example, if you are the Tweed Ring and you dominate New York City politics, well, the police chief and the police, administrators are going to be, police commissioners rather, are going to be sort of Tweed Ring appointees because very often they are going to be political positions. A lot of judges might only get local judgeships if they're given the blessing of Boss Tweed and the local Democratic Party machine. So if you're looking for kind of like, the justice system to ride in and save the day, don't hold your breath. So if the law can't do it or can't do it reliably, what else is left? Well, political cartoons. I know that sounds really ridiculous, but if there is a time period in which political cartoons really do change and shape American history, it's during this time period. Political cartoons, really before the Gilded Age, were pretty terrible. You've seen some of them from the late 1700s to early 1800s, and you have like speech bubbles that take up half the cartoon, and the dialogue is usually pretty terrible. It's unwitty, and the art is also just really gross looking. So I know, by the way, that I say that you shouldn't really sit back in judgment of the past, but this is where I'm saying don't be this me. But the person who kind of changes all this is Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is somebody that we're going to talk a lot about in this course, and you've already seen some of Thomas Nast's work. In fact, on the midterm, he was responsible for some of the cartoons and illustrations that you guys had to analyze, I would say that there is a greater than 50-50 chance of you seeing him referenced in some way, shape, or form on the AP exam. So Thomas Nast, by the way, is responsible for a number of key sort of innovations. Among them, by the way, he is the guy who develops our modern day image of Santa Claus, basically being this sort of fat, red-suited, elf-like person who goes around and delivers toys. I mean, before this, Santa Claus was kind of thought of as a religious figure, because his name is, I don't know, St. Nicholas. He's historically important because our idea of Santa Claus is based on him. But wait, there's more. He's also somebody who is a tireless defender of the Union cause during the Civil War. And I think you guys saw that in some of his cartoons. And he has serious haterade, or rather haterage, for Boss Tweed in Tammany Hall. Tweed expressed his opposition to Boss Nast and some of the tactics employed by his political machine through use of really simple, easy to understand cartoons. You can't really see this, unfortunately, because of my big ugly face, but behind me you have Boss Tweed. Never been this close to Boss Tweed before. It makes me uncomfortable. You have Boss Tweed standing menacingly over a ballot box, and on the ballot box there's text that says, "In counting there is strength." Basically playing on the quote that we talked about earlier. And by the way, Boss Tweed kind of becomes a 19th century meme. Here he is, by the way, with a face shaped like a money bag and this very well-known diamond brooch, which he was known for wearing in public. You also have images like this with Boss Tweed basically walking out of the city treasury with presumably a lot of money, and he's being rewarded, praised by police officers standing in the background and saluting him. And you, unfortunately, I should have resized this, I'm sorry. If you look at the bottom here, you have somebody who is taking bread from a bakery with a family sort of standing nearby in the distance, and this person is being arrested by the police, basically saying that it's okay for Boss Tweed to steal millions in taxpayer dollars, but it's not okay for a starving person to steal bread for his family. Now, the thing is that Boss Tweed was terrified of Thomas Nast and his cartoons, and the reason is because, as Tweed put it, let me back up. Boss Tweed was a figure who was routinely criticized in local newspaper editorials. But he didn't worry about those because nobody read them. Even at this point, Boss Tweed happens upon the realization that there is such a thing as TLDR. But as Tweed points out, the fact is that these pictures could be read and understood by anybody because they were so simple. And in fact, if you think of the fact that New York City's population was, let's say it comprised a large number of immigrants, many of whom couldn't read. The thing is that these cartoons could be easily understood by basically anybody, with or without lots of additional text. And this impacted Boss Tweed's sort of base of support particularly. And so Boss Tweed tried repeatedly to get Thomas Nast to sort of let up on some of these attacks. And Tweed actually sends an emissary to Thomas Nast to try to get him to basically take a study abroad opportunity in Europe, to go abroad and study art. And by the way, Tweed was also willing to throw in roughly $100,000 on top of that. And Thomas Nast, he pretended to be interested, and he said, well, that's a good offer, but I think I can do a little bit better. And the emissary went back with another offer. Nast said, well, again, generous offer, but I want to see a little bit more money there. Until eventually, Tweed's emissary goes to Thomas Nast with an offer of $500,000. Now, remember that this is in 1870s terms, where an ordinary person would be doing pretty well for themselves if they made $500 to $1,000 a year. So, in other words, this would have made Nast the equivalent of a millionaire. It would basically set him up for life. So, at this point, though, Nast turns down the offer with the following words. Well, I don't think I'll do it. I made up my mind not long ago to put some of those fellows behind bars. And that's just what happens. Tweed was eventually convicted in federal court on charges relating to corruption. Now, that being said, Tweed tries to flee the country. He travels to Cuba, and from Cuba, he basically boards a ship that is destined for Vigo, Spain. And when he steps off the ship, he is intercepted by Spanish customs officials who recognize him
from one of Thomas Nast's cartoons. If that's not the power of the press right there, I don't know what is. And by the way, it also signifies that newspapers are coming into their own as well, because they're now widely accessible, widely read, and it means that journalists, I know Thomas Nast isn't exactly a journalist per se, but journalists will increasingly become more powerful and more influential during the Gilded Age and afterwards, because they sort of fill a niche that needs to be filled. So we'll cut part one off right here. Next time, we're going to talk about part two and how the political stalemate is broken by the emergence of the Populist Party.